In 1920 at Johns Hopkins University, psychologist John Watson conducted the Little Albert experiment to learn more about the behavior and classical conditioning. Watson took a 9-month-old baby who had not demonstrated fear of rats and trained him that rats were scary. When Albert was 11 months old, Watson placed a rat on the table and began making loud noises while pounding on a steel bar with a hammer. Albert cried in reaction to the noises, and after a period of conditioning, cried in response to the rat even without loud noises. Watson gained insight that fear may have a critical impact on personal development.
For his research question, Watson hypothesized that the fearful response of children to loud noises is an innate, unconditioned response. He wanted to test the notion that by following the principles of a procedure known as classical conditioning, he could use this unconditioned response to condition a child to fear a distinctive stimulus that normally would not be feared by a child, in this case, furry objects.
Watson had originally planned to decondition Albert to the stimulus, assuming that conditioned fears could be reversed. However, Albert was removed from the experiment before this could happen. Watson created a child with a previously non-existent fear. Watson rationalized his treatment for little Albert by saying that even if they did not conduct the experiment on the child, he would experience similar conditioning as he grew older. According to today's ethical standards, the nature of the study itself would be considered unethical, as it did not protect Albert from psychological harm, because its purpose was to induce a state of fear. Many sources claim that little Albert was used as a subject in the study without the permission of his mother.
In today's society, this experiment would be considered unethical because it did not protect little Albert from psychological issues. Some critics point out that the study was done without any type of control. Albert's mother had no say in what they did in the experiment as well. Albert may not have been the healthy, normal boy Watson claimed him to be, but a neurologically impaired child who suffered from congenital hydrocephalus, which is when the fluid floods the brain. The young boy died at 6 years old, and this experiment had added additional stress to an already painful life.
In today's world, both the American Psychological Association and the British Psychological Association have well-developed code of ethics which any practicing psychologist have to adhere to. The Little Albert experiment broke the cardinal ethical rules for psychological research, those being 1. Do no harm, meaning psychologists have to reduce or eliminate the potential that taking part in a study can cause harm to a participant during or afterwards. Number 2, the participant's right to withdraw, meaning if you are involved as a participant in any psychological or medical study, you are given the right that you can withdraw at any stage during the study without consequence to you. Number 3, the principle of informed consent, meaning subjects have to be given as much information about the study as possible before the study begins so that they can make a decision about participating based on knowledge. And number 4, professional competence of the researcher, meaning the subjects can question the behavior of the psychologist in charge and have the ability to question the morals or reasoning of the experiment.
We begin in late 19th century Russia, where scientist Ivan Pavlov lived with his dogs. Whenever Pavlov would bring the dogs their food, they would salivate. One day, he walked into the room without food and was shocked to see that the dogs were still drooling in anticipation. What Pavlov had accidentally discovered was the concept of classical conditioning. He didn't have to do anything to make those dogs drool when they saw food, but Pavlov wondered if he did something to make the dogs think they were getting food, could he make them drool whenever he wanted to? And that's just what he did. Pavlov first identified the stimulus, the thing that caused the dog's response or behavior. In this case, the stimulus was the food because it caused the dogs to salivate. Then he paired the stimulus with a separate incident, the sound of a bell. Every time Pavlov brought the dogs food, he rang a bell. Once the dogs got used to the sound of the bell at feeding time, Pavlov tried ringing the bell without giving the dogs any food. And voila, the dogs started drooling anyway. Pavlov had successfully trained the dogs to react to the new stimulus, the ringing of the bell, the same way that they reacted to food. Classical conditioning is a learning process that inspired behaviorism. By taking an unconditioned stimulus, the food that naturally caused the dogs to salivate, and combining it with something entirely neutral, the bell, he was able to remove the first stimulus and make something that was formerly neutral elicit the conditioned response. But we'll talk about that later.
John B. Watson, an American psychologist, was intrigued by Pavlov's studies. He, along with many other behavioralists in the 20th century, believed that psychology should be a science, that is, based on facts and observable measurements. He believed that human development could only be based on what one could see.
Watson was famous for saying he could take any child and turn him into anyone he wanted, just by changing the child's environment. A musician, a lawyer, a businessman, a doctor, even a thief or a beggar. John Watson was most famous for his work with an 11-month-old infant named Little Albert. Although his methods would be highly unethical today, Watson made great strides in the field of behavioralism and classical conditioning. For example, Watson conditioned Little Albert to have a fear of rats, using a very similar method to the one used by Pavlov. Every time Little Albert was presented with a white rat, Watson made loud noises and startled the child and made him cry. After a while, all Watson had to do was bring the rat near Little Albert and the baby would scream and cry. In this experiment, the loud noises were considered the unconditioned stimulus. Little Albert didn't need to learn to be afraid of loud noises, just like the dogs in Pavlov's experiment didn't need to be taught to drool at the sight of food. These things provoke certain responses naturally. Therefore, Little Albert crying serves as the unconditioned response. Crying or screaming is a baby's natural response to loud noises. Likewise, drooling is a natural response for dogs that smell good food. Once Little Albert began to associate the neutral rat with the negative, loud noise, the rat became the conditioned stimulus. That is, the previously neutral object that now elicits a response. In Pavlov's experiment, this was the bell that eventually made the dogs drool. And that makes Little Albert's fear of the rats the conditioned response.